You don't need to read bio. You want to read my bio, it's in the handout material. I find it's always there.
It's a long one.
It's a long one. Not interesting. But I suppose let me start with my philosophy. That I'd really like to congratulate Dimitris for organising this.
Could you please briefly introduce yourself to?
So I'm a medical doctor. I'm on a panel later on, so I might tell you how my personal story about how I got really interested in the indoor environment and how the clinical impact that your role as building professionals have. But I'm on the Environmental Health Committee for ASHRAE 241, and this is where I've studied. I'll kind of get into that narrative as I go through. For me, my philosophy is exactly what Dimitris has organised here at this conference. First of all, just to say thank you to everybody in Athens, how welcome you've been, and to be here has been really inspiring. And actually, I took a trip to the Acropolis yesterday morning, and to look at those buildings got me thinking about buildings and why, as human beings, do we build buildings? We build them for shelter, they were places of worship, and so forth. So it's been very inspiring coming here. But also, Dimitris' philosophy of this conference is very similar to my own. This is a core diagram. And also, the chairman spoke about this morning. There's an expression in Ireland from a famous Irish literature person called George Bernard Shaw. And he talks about that if we meet each other and we just exchange an apple, if I have an apple and you have an apple, we leave that meeting just with an apple each. But if we come together and we exchange ideas, we all leave that convention with those ideas together. And that's what Dimitris has put together here. He's got medical doctors, surgeons, public health doctors together to really challenge your thinking. So what I'd like to do today is to show some models of my view of the world as a clinical doctor, as an emergency room doctor, and how I feel that your role in society is so important. And the way I've put up here, this is a core diagram. So if you think of all the stakeholders in the built environment, you've got the American Institute of Architects, the Building Owners and Managers Association, you have ASHRAE, and you have the facilities managers. What I found when they're speaking to each other about healthy buildings, they're just talking amongst their own audience. And ASHRAE actually probably one of the leaders, because they have a memorandum of understanding with the American Institute of Architects, with BOMA. So they're beginning to join the dots and start the flow of conversations. And what I'd like to do, and congratulate what Dimitris is doing here, is bring the voice of the patient and the voice of the doctor about the role of the built environment and how it can impact on clinical outcomes. And that's what I'm going to cover today in the talk. So I'm particularly going to drill in this concept that ASHRAE have with regards to the indoor environmental quality, not just indoor air quality. And ASHRAE in its strategic plan has a goal to have an IEQ standard. So what I'm going to look at is that could you use human biomarkers? Essentially, when you go to the doctor, you take a blood test or a urine test. Could the future building look at real-time biomarkers if we're going to have an IEQ standard? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So what I'll cover is the role of biomarkers, their significance currently in how we look at exposures to pollutants, and could they be an advantage to developing an IEQ standard with regards to give us an objective measurement of exposure, it can give early detection, it can give response time, so you can get that smart feedback loop of what's actually going in a building and how it's actually impacting the people in the building. So are construction professionals, ventilation professionals, architects, people in this audience, are you connected to the healthcare profession? And I would maintain you absolutely are, and I'm going to go through some data to realise why we need to shape some of the conversation in building design, but also why building designers and architects and ventilation professionals need to have more joined-up conversation with healthcare professionals. So one of the things that we talk about is this new concept of the exposome. And it's a little bit like one of the earlier speakers spoke about that double materiality. We have our own personal exposome, and you'll have heard about concepts like gut flora or your skin microbiome. There is a concept now that how we choose to live our daily lives, the perfumes we use, the skin products, has your own personal exposome. But then where you live and dwell and go to school, there's an environmental exposome. And they combine together an impact on you as a human being, and also then how well you are and your lifestyle will impact on your environment. So there's an emerging body of evidence that the exposome and what we're exposed to on a daily basis impacts our health and well-being outcomes, what we might describe as the social determinants of health. So if you look at some of the research of what they're spending in America, and just to give you some ideas, they spend $4 trillion in America on their healthcare budget. That's about 20% of their GDP. I think, again, the president, one of the earlier speakers, said after security issues, the idea of health and well-being is one of the biggest spends in a budget in a country. And essentially, America is going to cease to be competitive as a nation if they have to invest this amount of money in their healthcare budget. And the problem is, if you look at this study, of that $4 trillion, 85% of the money is spent on access to doctors and molecules and medication. But if you look at the real studies, what we call the social determinants of health, what actually dictates your health outcomes is your behaviors and your built environment. So about 70% of health outcomes are related to how we behave, our communities, and where we live. But very, very little of the USA healthcare budget is put into that. And I spoke at the American Institute of Architects this year, Dr. Gupta from CNN. He spoke that a lot of the healthcare is going into precision medicine, very, very expensive precision cancer medicine, and we're heroically pulling our patients out of the fire rather than investing money and stopping them falling into the fire in the first place. So the way I would like to communicate to you is, if you think of a spectrum of healthcare, you have the red end, the reactive, I'm an emergency room doctor, we'll have a surgeon speaking later on. This is kind of after the fact, when you become sick. And the ex-Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, used the expression that in America they don't have a healthcare system, they have a sickness reimbursement program. And my argument is that if you think, as you move down more and more less medical and more proactive, so your nurse, and you could keep coming down your physio, your occupational hygienist, your exercise coach, your mindfulness coach, you're coming down and getting less red, but you're having more of an impact on keeping people well rather than treating when they're becoming sick. And there is already evidence to show that $4 trillion they're spending in America is moving from the reactive end down to the proactive end. And I would argue that the people in this audience, your role in making healthy products, healthy buildings, good IAQ, good IEQ is actually contributing. I'm not going to turn you all into doctors, but what I want to say is you need to join the conversation with the healthcare professionals, because we spend 80% of our time indoors, and you're responsible for the air that we breathe in the built environment. So my view, again, I'm not a building professional. I'm what we might describe the why guy, and hopefully, again, as the president spoke earlier this morning, I know why it's really important that you do a good job and create healthy environments for us to live in. I don't know how to do it. I'm not a building engineer, I'm not an architect, I'm not a ventilation professional. But the way I look at it is, if you think, when we build buildings, and again, the buildings on the Acropolis, of course they've got to be safe and they've got to be built to code. But again, we had conversations this morning talking about going beyond code. And what I would say is, if there is sick building syndromes, you come from left to right on the spectrum, and indoor air pollutants, and when we tightened buildings in the first energy crisis, there was issues with VOCs. But really the conversation needs to move to the pink end about well-being, not just saying, I built a building and it won't fall on your head, and if there's a fire you can get out. I mean, that's not good enough anymore. What we want to say is, we've crafted a building to optimize you to thrive in the built environment where you spend 90% of your time. The challenge is, and Professor Sani spoke about this very well, so I'm not going to dwell on this, is that there's this natural tension at the moment. We all know we have to achieve energy efficient buildings, planet friendly buildings, but that would appear to be opposed to the fact that we also, in the post-pandemic world, need to improve air quality. And that sounds expensive. If I'm going to have an energy efficient building that also has got good air quality, it's going to cost me money. And there's this delta there, this life is conspiring against us. And my proposition to you today is we need to reframe that conversation, and the people who are going to win in the future who can actually say, yes, I can build a planet-friendly building, but because of the technology and the innovation, I can also build a person-friendly building as well. So planet-friendly and people-friendly. So again, this is my view, and hopefully we can have a debate about this in the panel discussion, but I like to break things up into quadrants. If I can get my pointer going here. So if you think in life, we have vulnerable population groups. Do I need that? Okay. I like to walk around, I don't like to be on the podium. So we have vulnerable population groups here, and then we have the general population. So that's on our y-axis here. And then you've got special situations, and you've got kind of standard situations. So we've got a vulnerable population in a special situation, and how do we manage a building for these group of people? In the pandemic, it was a special situation, and it applied to everybody, so that's another quadrant. Then you've got kind of standard situation, but it's care of the elderly or K-12 schools, and Dennis spoke about the work he did on K-12 schools. And then we've got healthy buildings for all. The challenge is getting return on investment metrics, and how can we actually prove it's worth doing an investment to move that? Over here, I think it's fairly obvious. So if we optimize hospitals and stop hospital-associated infections, there's an ROI, and maybe here as well. This is where there is very little evidence, and I'll talk about that and why I think there may be a role in the future for biomarkers. So the way I put this over is this right? I don't know. This is the question back to you guys when we get to the panel discussion. Is this ASHRAE 170? Is this ASHRAE 241, which we developed in the pandemic? Is this 62.2, and is this 52.2? Or maybe the new IEQ standard? And again, Darryl spoke about the design for healthy buildings, etc. So I think we need to have a conversation from my view of the world when I'm talking about various patient groups and your view of the world about how you ventilate those buildings. And we need to have a combined conversation. And obviously yesterday, Dr. Kosa spoke very, very well about AI and the use of in this setting here, hospital-associated infections. I think maybe you might be talking a little bit of it later on. What is the ventilation strategy, and what's the joined-up conversation we need to have on that area? Okay, so again, another model. This is my view of the world. It's absolutely clear to me that you know what to do to make an optimized building, a healthy building. We can actually now put in the sensor technology, and you say, okay, I did these things to this building, I then put in monitors into that building, and what I did works, and that building is healthy. That buildings can't be healthy, they're inanimate objects, the buildings can't breathe, we know all that. But what there's very little evidence is if I do the right things to the building, like the new ASHRAE headquarters, and then I prove it with my sensor technology, my airflow and ventilation rates, when I put people in that so-called associated building, do they do better? Is there any way we can measure clinically that a person in a healthy building is healthier? And there's very little data on that. So I won't talk about, Prof. Sani already spoke about what it possibly, between physical, chemical, bioburden, what it is actually potentially making us sick in that. But what I'd like to talk a little bit about is what we call the pathology or the pathogenesis. What is the pathway to disease and how is it happening? And when we understand the pathology of illness that arises from the built environment, then we can actually develop biosensors and we can begin to have a conversation about joining the dots. And obviously being in Greece, I've always liked to pull out how we know that pathos is from the ancient Greek. If something is apathetic or pathetic, it develops pathos or sadness or disease, and genesis, it generates disease, so that becomes a pathogen. So that's what we'll talk a little bit about. And again, I love to break things out into simple models. If you think about the pathogenesis of disease in the built environment, again, on this axis here, we're going to have the lungs, because generally the exposure pathway is inhalation. But although you may inhale something, the actual injury may happen far away from the target audience. You can inhale something, but it can injure your kidneys, it can injure your liver, and so forth. So we've got to look at the site of injury, and then you've got acute, so acute exposure, which comes from the Latin acutos, and then obviously chronic comes from the Greek chronic, chronos, which is time. So we break them down. If you're looking at your lung, an acute exposure, something like an asthma attack, and then Sandy also spoke a good bit about this, so I won't stay too long on this. Acute exposure to something you inhale, but can actually have effects somewhere else. Well, you can inhale something, and it can give you brain fog or headaches, and we know that from VOCs and formaldehyde and so forth. Or you can have long-term or chronic exposure, and that's going to cause like low-grade inflammation or pneumonitis. So it's not an allergic response, it's a chronic inflammatory response over time. Or then you can have, with long-term exposure, something can impact things like damage to your immune system or hormone dysregulation and so forth. So when you break it down, when we're talking about building-related illness or illness in the indoor environment, we need to think about the target organ, and we need to look at the timeline, and then we can start to talk about biomarkers. So what does acute mean? So that comes from the Latin, and what we're talking here, there's an immediate health effect. It's really more of an emergency response, carbon monoxide poisoning, sulfur dioxide. There's kind of an outbreak, and we get symptoms pretty quickly. It's a rapid exposure. So if you're going to look at an acute exposure thing, you're looking at vital signs, your heart rate would go up, your temperature might go up, and there's various other things we can do. Carbon monoxide, as an emergency room doctor, carbon monoxide is one that's very confusing, because normally if you've got lack of oxygen, you go blue, you're asphyxic, but carbon monoxide displaces the oxygen, so they're hypoxic, but they're actually coming red, because carbon monoxide displaces it from the hemoglobin. So it's a real one, the real clinical conundrum, what you do with a hypoxic patient that's not blue. Well, it could be carbon monoxide poisoning. So that's what we need to think about acute. If you're looking at chronic, again, this is the god of one of the Greek gods of time. You may take some time, I did put it on here, but I actually took it out because I thought it was a bit too shocking for you. But you might want to Google who Kronos was in relation to the Titans, and Uranus was his father, and so forth. But so when you think about chronic pain, you just think what happened to Kronos. But then if something's chronic, what you're really thinking about here is more of bioaccumulation over time, and you're looking at chronic exposure. So if the timeline is long, you're looking at clinical symptoms, much more chronic cough, something that's happened over to you, like a pneumonitis, an inflammatory lung picture. You'd use a completely different set of biomarkers, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So now we know a little bit about the target organs been injured, if it's your lung or your brain or your kidney. We've talked a little bit about, is it acute exposure or is it chronic exposure? Now you need to think about, well, what's the exposure pathway? So generally in a building it's going to be inhalation, but from the built environment, particularly if you're a child, obviously poisoning and ingestion, we can absorb things in buildings through our skin, and then if it's happening from all of the above, we'll call it systemic absorption. So again, if we're going to look at having a biomarker or relate how is the building impacting on my health outcomes, we need to look at what's the exposure pathway. So obviously, if I have an allergic asthmatic reaction, it's probably going to be mold, or not probably, it's possibly could be mold in my built environment, and the exposure pathway there is inhalation. So once we've looked at all those various clinical situations, we now say, well, could we possibly use a biomarker? And if we were going to choose a biomarker to relate the built environment, it would have to be specific to the pollutant, and would need to be sensitive, would need to be specific as well. So we don't have false positives, we don't have false negatives. And obviously, it's going to need to be something that's easy to do and implement if this is something we could do in the future, cost effective and so forth. So what could those biomarkers be? Well, very simple. When you go to the doctor, he takes your heart rate. He takes your blood pressure, your respiratory rate, and your body temperature. And these are good because they're non-invasive, they're real-time, they're easily measurable, there's not a lot of intervention, you can do it with general practice. The problem is, and we saw this in the COVID crisis, before you went to work, they may do a thermometer on your head. If your temperature's gone up, or your heart rate's gone up, you're already infected, so it's after the fact. So it's not really going to be a good preventative monitor. So there's challenges with using vital signs as a biomarker. We've all got a biomarker. We're all wearing smartwatches. We could all link your heart rates now here. Has it gone up because the carbon dioxide's gone up afterwards? Is it gone down because we all had lots of lunch and we're falling asleep? So it would be very easy to do, but is it really correlating to the built environment? And are there other, what we call in medicine, confounding variables? You have very fit and you have a lower resting heart rate than I do, so yours is high. Does it actually correlate to anything in the built environment? So big challenge is using vital signs. There are another new host of biomarkers, respiratory biomarkers. This company has just received significant funding in Silicon Valley, and we're calling it a breath biopsy. So rather than a lung biopsy, you can just breathe into this machine. Everybody has a unique VOC profile. And then I can begin to diagnose early cancers, and some of them now have biochip markers on them as well, that you just breathe into it in real time. In about 30 seconds, it can diagnose if you've got COVID or another type of flu virus as well. So possibly that's something that we could look at in the future. We've been using it in asthma, and your expired nitrous oxide rate is actually a very good non-specific marker of inflammation in your lungs. So we correlate our treatment and management of asthma and allergy looking at FeNO. Something else we can do at lunch, we're talking to a colleague and a friend who's talking about his hemoglobin 1AC. So these is something that we've used very, very well, taking a blood test. You go in, you go to the doctor, we spike you, we draw some blood, we look at your lipids or your blood profile, and we can manage your medical conditions by looking at that. Probably diabetes is the one that's been most studied in this area. And there are new novel technologies. This is actually an Irish company, it's Limbo. This technology's been around, I believe you get it on Canadian healthcare. But you put a patch on, it's got various microneedles on it, that will go straight to your mobile phone, and you keep your blood sugar within a certain window, and people are using it for weight loss and health management. But very, very easy technology where we're using real-time data. And I suspect something like this could be miniaturized, and maybe something could be on your phone or on your watch in the future going forward. Other type of biomarkers you'll be familiar, we use within the medical industry, this type for drug testing. Again, probably chronic exposure. Remember I spoke about the timeline and the exposure pathway. Metabolites of VOCs, other things in toxic buildings like cadmium, mercury, that type of stuff we can pull up in urine samples. And it's not invasive, but I don't think anybody's going to go to work on Monday morning and say, oh, because we want to have a healthy building, everybody's got to give us a urine sample. So I don't think that's going to work either. Salivary biomarkers, again, something we do if you go for, say, health insurance. I'll take a saliva marker. If you say you're a smoker or non-smoker, and you can pick up the fact you're smoking. You can actually take hair samples. Again, much more of a kind of a chronic bioaccumulation picture. But you could possibly do that. You do salivary biomarkers and say, look, there's something going on in that building. People are getting sick. We've got kind of Monday morning malaise. So let's do salivary tests and see, is there actually something? It could be phthalates, it could be an environmental toxin, it could be house dust mite allergen, we spoke about that. So salivary biomarkers is something that could be used. And then you get onto the much more expensive type things where it's genomics, we look at phenotypes. We all know that exposome, that your concept of epigenetics, that your environment that you live in can actually damage DNA, damage your mitochondria. And we can now have these tests where we're actually looking at breakdown of your DNA structure and impacts like that. Problem is they're very, very expensive and they're complex, and the technology is fairly rudimentary and wouldn't be appropriate for a screening tool. So they're the type of biomarkers we have. Then we need to look at ways, well, how can we get data? So these are kind of data harvesting tools. Yesterday, one of the people spoke about your iWatch. He was talking about AI and buildings. If you fall over, could your iWatch show there's been a fall? So there's already people using sensor technologies. If you're a doctor here, we wear these, okay, my 5-minute warning, my yellow card. We wear these, which are kind of, if you're exposed to X-rays, you clip it onto your white coat. And then at the end of the month you have to hand that in. So again, we are monitoring, say, exposure to our occupational exposure, the built environment, what we're doing, and is that being sensed? You'll see sound monitors. Again, don't forget IEQ is going to look at lighting, it's going to look at sound, and it's going to look at IAQ. And people will wear these, and you'll put it, again, it's just a sensor, it's a microphone, and it's tracking your noise exposure over a period of time. As I mentioned, we all are wearing these anyway. So there's lots of ways we can gather data on a real-time basis and have this smart feedback loop. And remember, smart doesn't mean just something's clever. A smartwatch or whatever, it means sensing, monitoring, and assessing in real time. S-M-A-R-T. So we need smart feedback loops. When I walk into the building on Monday morning at work, what's my biosensor, what's my data harvester telling me? And the other thing you can do, which we're not very good at as doctors, we can actually talk to our patients. We can actually ask them. So you can do surveys, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with the work that's been done in Harvard with Joe Allen, and he's done all the work around, kind of a bit controversial to speak to Paolo Mogocchi, but he's looking at Stroop tests, high decision making, increased CO2, lots of conversations in the ASHRAE 241 committee about, is CO2 a toxin, is it just a bioeffluent, does high levels of CO2 actually impact on you? A lot of debate in that area. But when you think about most of the people in buildings, we're now knowledge workers. We're not in Victorian factories pulling levers and doing things like that. We're value-added knowledge workers, and we're paid to think. We're knowledge brokers. We're innovating. We're having ideas. So surely then it makes a lot more sense to make sure that building is really optimized, particularly if I want to work from home. And now my employer is saying, no, I want you in because we're doing innovation, and we want to have a culture session. You as an employer needs to say, well, look, if you come into this building rather than staying at home, I have a duty of care to make sure that that building is healthy and optimized for your health and well-being. So there'll be good food, you can cycle to your bike, there may be a meditation room. So indoor air quality, indoor environmental quality has become a strategic HR issue. It's no longer just a facilities management issue. So this type of stuff is again, doing health surveys. We're doing the dreaded Slido. I better finish on time or get a bad mark. But this idea, we're getting real feedback loops. We're doing surveys all the time. Survey, what are the speakers like? Will there be surveys? What's the building like on a daily basis? So just to sum up then, so what are we talking about? Well, what I'm kind of saying is there's a big convergence of technologies. I'm involved in the Consumer Technology Association. There's a digital tech innovation group in that. And what we're saying is consumer tech and med tech are converging, they're coming together. And I actually think clean tech and building tech is going to come together. And there's no doubt, there's this picture of Elon Musk, I know he's like slightly inflammatory character these days, but there's no doubt there is going to be a convergence of building tech, health tech, and clean tech, and all the technology you're developing for planet-friendly buildings, sustainable buildings, ESG. We heard speakers about ESG earlier on. That will now, the next paradigm is, okay, it's good for the planet, is it good for people? So when we do the deep retrofits, we do the energy efficient buildings, we heard again from the President, the amount of buildings that's going to be retrofitted. There's a massive opportunity to have a huge public health impact if we can get all this joined together. There's no doubt they're coming together. So what does the future hold? Well, I think this is a futuristic hospital room. I think there's no doubt the built environment of a hospital and in those special settings will be connected. The lighting, the energy, the heating, the biomarkers, the health and well-being. We already have telemetry in hospital ICU beds. So future focused building, that telemetry will be on your watch, or will be on your phone, or your bedroom at home will be optimized for light and sound, to have restorative sleep, regenerative sleep. The built environment, how it restores you, regenerates you, keeps you well, and keeps you out of hospital, so you don't spend $4 trillion on giving people tablets. The built environment is part of that conversation. I have no doubt about that, and you need to be part of that conversation. And if you don't believe me, because I know there's several Canadians that I've had dinner with over the few days over here, I put this last slide in specifically. This is why I updated the slides, Dimitris. Caused a lot of trouble updating the slides, but this is a Canadian product. And if you think of what's probably the most technologically advanced building in the world we know of, well, the International Space Station. That's a building, isn't it? And people live on there, they sleep on there, and it's got connected sensor technology. You have to manage their airflow, they have to manage their build-up of VOCs, bioeffluent, etc. But now all the building of the space station is directly connected to the biomarkers, the clinical impact of the astronauts on there. So there's already an example of the merging of the built environment and biomarkers and the clinical environment. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Yes? No hard questions now.
Thank you very much for your so interesting presentation. It was really exciting, and I'm really very glad to see that you promote the use of exposome concept to be applied in the indoor environment. I mean, talking with colleagues from toxicology department, I know that there are data actually which are related to the outdoor environment. So my question is, have you collected any data using these biomarkers in the indoor environment?
There is data. We haven't done any data, but if you think about if it's dry in here and you get dry mucous membranes, you're much more likely to have an asthmatic or allergic reaction. There's what we call in medicine an adjuvant effect. So you may have an exposure to house dust mite allergen, which wouldn't trigger an allergic response. You then add in formaldehyde into that environment. The formaldehyde destables your mucous membrane, and then it will trigger an allergic response. So that kind of feedback loop between my environment, how it impacts on me, and how I impact my environment, it's all around us. But you're right, there isn't data on that. As I said that, we know how to make healthy buildings. We can put sensors in to show them they're healthy. But apart from maybe Joe Allen, there's very few people showing people are healthier in healthy buildings. The only place that has been shown with the exposome is removing mold in underserved communities in America and decreasing asthma rates and school absenteeism. But that's my challenge. We need to come together and produce that data.
Thank you. I would rather go last. You will understand when you hear my question. If there is anyone else that wants to make a question more relevant to the subject, I will attempt to be a little bit out of all the subject here. So if anyone else has to...
Well, I think there's a panel discussion after.
Okay.
But please do, but hopefully we'll have some conversation there.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you very thoughtful, Dr. McKEON. I particularly love the way you took the term indoor air quality and you elevated that to the broader spectrum of indoor environmental quality, which is open to many translations, I should say, in my opinion. So, and since in this community of our building professionals of the building industry rather, we don't have the chance so often to discuss with the medical doctors such as you, I will attempt to go completely out of subject and ask this. What about acoustics comfort in a building? What about protection from noise, which pretty much could be the very noise that is generated by those systems that we use in order to create a healthier indoor air environment in some aspect? Do you believe this is a variable we may need to add to the total equation of the discussion?
I'm not a noise expert, I'm not clinically a noise doctor, but it's a really good question. Let me answer it this way, telling a story. So there is a harm metric for noise. So above that, either acutely, we know that's bad, and we know chronically that's bad, and there's numbers for that. So the way that the community at the moment is thinking, well, the opposite to bad is good. Well, that's not the case. Just because that level causes harm doesn't mean below that level is actually good or restorative or regenerative or makes you thrive in the indoor environment. So there is a tendency, because there's a kind of, as medics, we like to be experts and be black and white, and as engineers, you like to have numbers. Above, bad, thresholds, threshold limit values, occupation exposure limit values, TLVs, all those things. But they're harm. The opposite to harm is not well-being. And there's a big conversation to have about harm, well, and well-being, and thriving, and restorative, and regenerative. And we're just not there. There's no metrics or numbers on that.
By the way, any of our other speakers can join in the discussion.
Please.
Any more questions? Kindly evaluate the topic, please. Go to slide.
I'll be bribing people at the back. I want to get invited back by Dimitris, so give me a good score, please.
I did. Thank you very much.